Minute?
Yep.
All right. So today our guest speaker is Beau Keyte. Beau, you want to say something so the camera will switch over to you?
Yeah. Is it switching over now?
Yep, it's switched over there and we see your face
Cool.
even. So Beau,
Cool.
welcome virtually to San Luis Obispo once again. So I know you'd rather be here in person. So where are you hanging out at the moment?
Well, as you can see, I'm hanging out at my office outside Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I wanted to give a shout out to everyone who chose to go to Cal Poly as opposed to the University of Michigan. It's a little bit warmer there, and there's a student there, I think it's Elisa Frost, who was outside with her shades on, getting ready in a sunny day to go to slide into class. I thought that I really want to send the message that you made the right decision.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that affirmation, Beau. I appreciate it. So Beau, thanks for being our celebrity guest once again. Just as by way of introduction, I think Beau is one of the few guests that I have on here who actually has an earlier start date than me in the world of wean. I think Beau is back in the 80s somewhere. So he's been at this a long time. He's written several books on the topic of wean. He's got like the book on value stream mapping for the office. Beau's had a lot of great experience, and Beau, I really appreciate your being here and taking the time to talk to these students today.
No problem. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So Beau, you want to tell people a little bit about what your current role is and the ways you try to affect change using lean? Like what are you doing now?
Yeah, so a few things. Let's see, where do I want to start? I'm most worried about how people learn better and change faster. So there's a lot of dynamics going on there that goes beyond the tools in terms of how you learn, how you facilitate, and how you allow others to learn. So what I'm working on now are ways to have large organizations learn very quickly with hardly any outside help, and I'm an outside helper. So there are collaborative learning models that are very effective, and so that's working out well. The other end is kind of attaching myself. Have you talked about the Shingo model to anybody in class?
No, but it'd be a good time to maybe talk about it a little bit because the students have an assignment coming up in a week or so where they have to do a Shingo model assessment for their particular project.
Yeah. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but it's a guide. It's a roadmap to improve your performance as an organization by focusing on behaviors, which is very different than focusing on tools. So if you try to think, well, we can do all the tools in the world, but if we behave the same way, nothing's going to change. So how do you kind of categorize those behaviors and see signs or lack thereof of certain behaviors to what is helpful to move forward? And so I'm using that piece of it. I'm associated with the Shingo Institute, and I'm using a piece of that to help leadership in terms of coaching and facilitating how they need to change their behavior to run in parallel with changes in the process.
So Beau, that's sort of really interesting. So if I was looking at an organization and I was trying to assess whether they were, learning, like what kind of behaviors would I look for, or what would be an example of a good behavior I would see?
Well, so an example might be don't tell the people what to do.
Okay.
So if the best way to learn is to struggle by yourself, maybe with some help, but struggle and figure out a way to do it, as opposed to your manager coming in and say, just do it this way and walk away. Because if you're being that directive, then you're not helping them learn. All they're doing is following your lead. And if it doesn't work, your only option is to blame your manager because it didn't work, as opposed to trying it on your own, understanding what does and doesn't work and move forward.
So it's almost like, if I was in a meeting and observing, I would see people maybe asking more questions than being more directive in, we should do X or Y. it'd be more of a questioning mode. Like, well,
Yeah,
what's
so
that question?
yeah, I actually have an example from this morning on this I can share. Along that line, I went to a conference that was focused on creating groups of CEOs to work together on problems and move themselves forward. And it was kind of a membership thing meeting. And so they had some exercises. One was, let's pick someone with a problem, and then we can ask them questions about the problem. And so the person who was selected at my table is a COO, and she's a fundraiser for a private school in Detroit. And she says, I'm stuck. I'm stuck because I can't raise any more money. Since I've come, I've tripled the amount of cash, but now I'm just stuck, and I'm frustrated because I'm stuck. And the other people at the table were actually suggesting stuff. Well, have you tried this? Have you tried this? Have you tried this? Have you tried this? They're full of solutions. And when it came to me, it said, I want to know what stuck means. So do you have a goal? Does the organization agree with the goal? And what's moving on there, and how stuck are you? So what does good look like?
Right.
And by asking those questions, and she had never put a number on how much she really wanted to raise. All she knew is she wanted to do more. And that's a very dangerous place to be in, because you never know when you're going to be happy or how much the organization needs. So questions I was asking was not towards solutions, but towards a deeper understanding of how she feels she's stuck, and if the organization agrees, because that's a whole different situation.
Right. Well, and I like how, and I sort of imagine this, if you did this in a meeting, it would also shift the whole dynamic of the meeting away from the sort of brainstorming a list of potential solutions to actually maybe, like as the students are trying to walk a little bit more towards, well, what's the root cause, or what's sort of the kernel of the problem that we have to really address and focus on, right?
Yeah, and the reason I like something like the Domaic approach is that if you really think thoughtfully, if you're really thoughtful about it, you are forced to become very deliberate in step by step by step. And the longer you hang on to trying to understand what's going on, the easier it's going to be to solve the problem. So I've always put a lot more weight into the questions you ask as you're unveiling the issues, or just examining the patterns that create the problem.
Right. Yeah, no, really interesting. So I'm gonna we'll stay in this sort of thoughtful space here, but there is a time in projects where you have to go from, always asking, right? So you're in that sort of analysis phase, but you can also fall into the analysis paralysis. So what's the key for you in when you should lock in and everybody says, okay, we need to test this idea before we can go further, or how do you recognize that, or how do you coach people along those lines?
To a certain extent, so I work with people in organizations, and the biggest question I have for them is, what else would be helpful to understand before we kind of snap the chalk line and move on to testing something? Right. And they usually have a few things. So we walk into the room, we walk into the situation, and they can tell me what they know about the problem. And one of my questions is, well, what else would be helpful to know? Because if we run down this road right now, we might be going off on the side somehow, or taking an exit ramp. So what else should we know that would clarify the issue enough that we can start to test something?
Okay. Good. So Beau, so now, that was the fun part for you and me. But I've got a bunch of students here that would probably like to hear a little bit about, some of the organizations or war stories or challenges that you faced, and maybe what you've learned from them. So do you have any sort of good examples or bad examples of how to do things, or what should be done?
Well, one of the ones I'm proudest of is with an insurance company in Wisconsin, when they had, actually this is to legal claims, and they have automotive insurance. And for those of you who have had the not good problem of having an accident and possibly being sued. Once you're sued, the insurance company takes over because it's their money that's being paid out. So they have their own lawyers protecting their own interests, and they become your lawyer. And so this is a claims activity, and they were taking too long, and they were also, as a result of taking too long, they were outsourcing some cases to very expensive outside counsel. And what they tried to do was figure out what's in the way, what's keeping us from closing cases sooner, not without giving the shop away, and how do we do more cases and not outsource so much to expensive counsel. And they use a collaborative approach, and they have 17 field offices around the country, and they would approach the same type of problem, but they weren't told to use the same solution, because different field offices have different issues. They have different local laws that could change how they have to approach a case in court. They have different mixes of resources. They have different numbers of clients or lawyers. So they were given the same problem, but given the free will to chase the solutions that make sense in their own situation. So in doing so, they came up with different solutions and hit the same goal, which is really, really important to understand, that you don't just have to have one solution to hit the same goal. You hit to something that's meaningful to the people inside your team and hit the goal, and people won't bother you as long as you make the goal. So by doing so, in the first wave, they found different solutions to hit the similar goals, and then they started, and they shared their solutions, and they shared their tests. And when they were done with their own solutions, they said, well, I kind of like what the St. Louis did over there. I think I want to try that someplace else. So they were actually understanding how other people were thinking and incorporating that into other problems inside the offices. The upside is every field office is now insourcing $2 million worth of legal fees a year.
Wow.
So, and these are not large offices. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And they're not working hard. They're not working longer hours.
Yeah.
They've made the process easier for them to move forward and deal with the clients.
Yeah. No, it's actually, I was doing the math there. So 17 offices times 2 million, is that $34 million?
Yeah, so that's the performance piece. The other piece that you have to be happy at work. So this particular company spends a lot of time with, puts a lot of backing behind annual employee satisfaction surveys. It's a really big deal to them. And in 1 year, the legal department went from last in place to first in place. And that did not go unnoticed. That was, wow, what are you doing? And they said, we're finally allowed to work on our own and solve problems on our own without being told by corporate how to do it.
Yeah. And Beau, I know you've sort of had this experience, but for me, working with teams, when you see that sort of switch in the employee attitude about their work and their job, that's really pretty gratifying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah. So I'm gonna encourage our students to formulate some good questions for Beau. Who's probably in his career, there's probably nothing he hasn't really tackled. So if you go ahead, if you've got a question, go ahead and type it in the chat room, and we'll go ahead and call out your name. You go ahead and ask your question in person. Is there anybody in the classroom that wants to take a shot at a question for Beau? My in-class team are going to come through for me big time on this. Then we got any people in the chat room?
Nothing yet, no.
Beau is one of these high-priced lean consultants, and if you've got a mini project question that he can solve for you, it's probably well worth what you're going to wind up paying. Right? Okay, you got questions in the classroom here. Go ahead and switch that camera around there.
Okay.
There you go.
Hi, Beau. I'm actually a sociology major.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you solve behaviors, and specifically if you come at that from a psychological perspective, a sociological perspective, what grounding do you have when you come at these issues?
That's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I will say that you walk into the Shingle model with the leadership understanding that this is really different. And the best thing to do, I'm going to get geeky on you because it's not necessarily counseling people. It's saying, hey, where do we want to be? How would you, so if we want to just take the example that we don't want to tell people what to do. We want to coach them on how to think about the problem they're at hand and have them do the thinking by themselves. So one way, so you would enter it saying, what's the downside of always telling them what to do? So we have open, and usually people have really good examples of really bad things that happened when they said, hey, I was just following your lead, man. You told me what to do. So they have real examples that they can put on the table saying, well, then how do we start undoing that? And what's the plan? And how would we pilot this to see what happens? So any change that we go after, even if it's behavior change, is always an experiment. You're starting at a baseline. You have to be able to find what you want at the end. So if you say, hey, I know I need to be directive once in a while, but maybe over the next 2 months, I can cut in half. So then you say, well, how are you going to do that? And you create a plan together and have them follow the plan and then check. So I don't talk about the make as much as I do PDCA, but either one is an experiment. So all of this stuff is piloting. And so they're constantly challenging how good they are, how good they should be, and how they have to continue the behaviors. Now, how they check it is something else. So I like to have kind of a buddy system where the person who is trying to have a behavior change has a peer who's observing. And then there's a feedback loop after that. Say, well, I saw you do this and this and this and this. Did you know that you were being directive here? And talk about it and then create a countermeasure or a new plan for the next time. And then they switch roles. So the other person goes into a session and the first person is now observing. And so they help each other with the same problem, with the same experiment, if you will. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Beau, maybe, it's nice to have, psychology students in this class because I'm a big fan of trying to get some lean psychology things sort of going. But, if we could sort of, when you're being directive, identify some sort of typical models for being directive. What I'm familiar with is the personal movie. So somebody comes in and asks you, well, what should I do? As opposed to, leading them down a questioning path, you say, well, when I was a young engineer, this is the way we solved that problem, right? Or here's my, 20 years of experience. You kind of read back your personal video story to people. So if you see that sort of thing, that's sort of a known, path that a lot of managers go down that, maybe they need to avoid that somewhat. Right?
Yeah, because the reality is, since they were that age, things have changed.
Yeah.
So simply because it worked for them doesn't mean it's going to work ever again.
Right.
And so if we recognize that going in, we said, well, I used to do that work, but that was a really long time ago. So maybe I ought not to be forcing solutions on people and say, how should we think about this?
Yeah, excellent. Other questions in the chat room?
Suzanne.
So Suzanne, you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Yeah, hi. I was wondering if there's any lean or leadership books that you read or people that you watch.
Yeah. Guys, see this? Eric, do you use this?
Yeah. So this is John Chook's Managing to Learn book.
Yeah. So that's a great one because it's 2 books. Have they read it yet?
No, they don't read that in this class.
Okay, it's 2 books in one. One is the worker who's being challenged to solve a problem, And it's a hard problem when he can't do it by himself. He's got to reach out, and he's not used to reaching out and talking to people. So that's one story. The other story is the manager who's trying desperately not to tell the guy what to do. And so you see him challenged about, I could just solve this damn thing right now. But I can't, because if I solve it for him, he won't be able to build the capabilities to solve the problem on his own later on. It is a fascinating story. And so I recommend that on the kind of lean leadership. That being said, that's more like management than leadership, but it's the management side of leading, if you will.
Right. Yeah, so for those people that, not as familiar as Beau and I with this book, it's really kind of interesting. So on the left-hand side page is the worker, and on the right-hand side page is the manager. And so you're kind of getting this parallel stream of what each other's thinking and what they're trying to do without necessarily telling each other sort of what that is, right?
Yeah, it's fascinating construction. I give John a lot of kudos for it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Other questions for Beau? How about we get one more question to send Beau on his way? Somebody can do that. Raise your hand if you just want to ask it directly.
Got one here. Ryan.
Ryan, go ahead and ask your question. Thank you for doing this. Hey, Ryan, you there?
Hello.
Yeah, hey, Ryan, go ahead and ask your question.
I was just curious, you were talking about there's more than one solution to a problem. I was just curious how you go about deciding which solution to go for, because in my mind, I would think that one might have a different effect in the long run, but I'm wondering if there's a process to monitor those solutions.
I'll be blunt. I don't worry about that, but I need to qualify that. First, the ultimate answer for a solution today. So if you had competing solutions today and they both work, the ultimate answer would be which fits the best within those cultures, because it has to be absorbed and embraced by the people who are going to be working that solution. And so you could still have two different field offices make two different decisions on which one's best for their culture. So that's one thing. However, moving forward, the reason I don't worry about it is because continuous improvement insists that you keep on looking for more. So it's good enough today, and if you maintain, so if you set up a KPI or a visual that shows how shows the impact of that solution over time, and it starts to degrade, you have some problem solving to do. That's without making further changes. So if you see, hey, I want a service level agreement, a turnaround time of a quote of 48 hours, and you're maintaining 48 hours, all of a sudden it slips to 60 hours. Well, something's wrong. And so you sign up to understanding why it changed, because it was running fine for a while. So what's different? And so you start going into root cause analysis to bring it back to 48 if you can. That's in a static situation. But at the same time, most of my teams aren't as worried about the degradation of performance as looking for additional challenges and getting better. So they're trying more things. That's a great question.
Yeah, no, it is. Well, Beau, I thank you very much for spending some time with us today. I know it's probably dark and cold where you are, getting there at this point in time.
So I need to tell you, I was in northern Michigan over the weekend, and we rented a rural farmhouse. We couldn't see anybody else from where we were. And on Sunday, there were 60-mile-an-hour winds and 8 inches of snow blowing sideways. It was really freaky.
Yeah. Well, it sounds wonderful. Sorry. So Beau, before you go, though, do you have any good words of wisdom or parting advice for these folks just starting out on their lean journey?
I think in addition to the tools you're using, find a way to demonstrate you're being respectful of those you're working with, and you're not trying to run roughshod over their thinking. Give them a chance to think too, and incorporate them in the solution. And then by doing so, they will embrace it as opposed to resist it because they had no part in it, and it's just you thinking it's better.
Yeah. No, Beau, thank you very much for that. That's excellent advice. Let's go ahead and give Beau a hand. And so we're going to go ahead and thank you, Beau. We're going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break. So about